It was immediately condemned. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called it a horrific anti-Semitic murder, and many Israeli leaders turned their criticism outward.
This is the direct result of toxic anti-Semitic incitement against Israel and Jews around the world that has been going on since the October 7th massacre.
In fact, at a news conference just after news of the shooting broke, Gideon Sa'ar, the Israeli foreign minister, actually accused Israel's critics abroad.
This incitement is also done by leaders and officials of many countries and international organizations, especially from Europe.
Particularly in Europe, where he said some international organizations and government officials had used words like
genocide,
crimes against humanity,
paved the way exactly for such murders.
And Sa'ar tried to draw a straight line between this criticism of Israel and the horrible killing of the young couple. But this is really an enormously emotionally charged debate. In fact, some in Israel's opposition actually blamed Israeli government policies, which they said were fueling anti-Semitism around the world.
But these criticisms of Israel are not new, right? Like leading human rights groups, including Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the International Criminal Court, they've all accused Israel of human rights abuses for months. And that's been an ongoing part of the condemnation of Israel's war in Gaza. So is there something specific that this foreign minister thinks has changed in all of this?
Let's be clear, this is standard rhetoric from the foreign minister. There's been enormous international concern over the toll of the war in Gaza. According to Palestinian health officials in Gaza, more than 50,000 people have been killed since the beginning of the war, and especially over the last week. Some of Israel's own traditional allies have dramatically ratcheted up their public condemnations of Israeli policies towards Gaza. And to understand that, you really have to understand the situation on the ground in Gaza right now.
Rights groups have condemned the decision to block desperately needed food, fuel, and medicine, accusing Israel of using starvation as a weapon of war.
For more than 2 months, Israel barred the entry of all humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip. That meant no food, no fuel, no medicine.
A total blockade.
Right, exactly.
Day 51 of a complete blockade of aid-dependent Gaza. It's a desperate daily struggle to get some food as scarce supplies run out.
As the blockade went on over the past 2 months, we started to hear reports that the situation was getting worse and worse. And that really led to a growing chorus of criticism that began to crescendo in early May.
If the blockade persists, all 2.1 million Gazans would be at critical risk of famine, according to a UN-backed assessment.
A UN-backed panel of experts warned that there was a critical risk of famine due to the dwindling stockpiles of food inside the Gaza Strip.
Israel is deliberately and unashamedly imposing inhumane conditions on civilians in the occupied Palestinian territory.
UN officials began issuing war warnings about how dire the situation was becoming on the ground in Gaza. And in the middle of all of this, Israeli leaders begin starting a drumbeat of threats and warnings, which suggests that they are going to launch a major ground offensive in Gaza that could potentially upend everything in the Gaza Strip.
And just by ground offensive, you mean a full-scale takeover of the Strip?
That's what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is talking about. And I think all of this together has really begun to cause a dramatic shift in the way that even Israel's traditional allies are talking about Israeli policy toward Gaza. So this week, we saw Canada, Britain, and France come out with some of the strongest condemnations of the Israeli blockade on humanitarian aid entering the Gaza Strip. We also saw the new Pope call for the immediate entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza and for the war to come to an end.
We're looking at Gaza, and we got to get that taken care of.
We also recently saw President Trump discuss the dire humanitarian conditions in Gaza.
A lot of people are starving. A lot of people, there's a lot of bad things going on.
Pro-Palestinian critics have argued that the shift has been mostly rhetorical. But Britain on Tuesday actually did announce that it was suspending further negotiations on expanding its free trade agreement with Israel. And this was very clearly a protest against Israeli policies.
Given the global condemnation of this blockade, Israel must have known that it would be controversial, right? Even among its allies. So what was the aim?
Back in January, Israel and Hamas agreed on a ceasefire. The goal of the ceasefire was ultimately to reach an end to the war and free the remaining Israeli and foreign hostages who are still held by Hamas in the Gaza Strip. The first part of the ceasefire is slated to last 6 weeks, which took Israel and Hamas all the way up to early March. At that point, both sides were deadlocked over the next steps in the truce. And this is when Israel applies that blockade on Gaza, on all humanitarian aid entering the Gaza Strip, in what Israeli officials called an attempt to pressure Hamas. Basically, their argument was negotiations over freeing the remaining hostages that Hamas is still holding in Gaza have reached a dead end. And Israel also argues that a lot of the humanitarian aid that goes into Gaza is exploited by Hamas, that Hamas either diverts it or takes control of it, stores it for its own purposes, or makes money off of it. So from Israel's perspective, this was a key sort of pressure point where they could make their opponents feel the pain. And then 2 weeks after that blockade begins, Israel resumes attacking Hamas in Gaza, ending the ceasefire.
And all of this, of course, becomes much worse. Can you just talk a little bit about the changes you've seen?
So Gazans who we speak to have talked about street markets that have relatively little food to offer, and whatever they do have is at unattainable prices. People scrounging whatever they can from canned food or surviving from basically communal soup kitchens. But even those have also increasingly struggled to keep up their operations as the stockpiles of food in Gaza have dwindled. So a lot of people have lost a lot of weight. Doctors in the enclave say that it's starting to affect people's health. And my colleague, Erica Solomon, actually spoke to Dr. Ahmed Al-Farra, a pediatrician in Gaza, who told her that, some people are dying of diseases simply because they're so malnourished.
They need the protein. They need the fresh protein.
When there's, widespread hunger, it's not necessarily that people are going to die of starvation or wasting away, but that their body's immune system might simply become too weak to fight off diseases that they might otherwise be able to fend off.
I wonder, as these conditions have gotten worse and worse and the blockade has been ongoing, what does Israel say about it? Do they acknowledge the situation, or how have they responded?
For the first several weeks, Israeli officials took a very clear stance. They said that more than enough supplies had entered Gaza during the ceasefire to provision Gaza for months, and that the blockade was not causing widespread suffering to ordinary Palestinian civilians living in Gaza. But as the blockade wore on, weeks and weeks later, some Israeli military officers privately began to change that assessment. Finally, on Sunday evening, the Israeli government announced that in order to prevent starvation, they were going to allow some amount of food into the Gaza Strip. So we've started to see some aid trickle in over the past few days. But now everybody is watching and waiting to see what happens next. That is to say, is Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu actually going to follow through on the massive military operation in Gaza that Israeli leaders have been threatening for weeks?
We'll be right back.
The Daily is supported by Total Wine & More, helping shoppers love what they find this summer season at TotalWine.com. Drink responsibly, be 21.
Innovative, immersive, and skillfully investigated. The Daily brings listeners today's stories as only the New York Times can report them. For more on today's episode, go to nytimes.com/thedaily. Distribution of The Daily is made possible by American Public Media. APM produces and distributes programs that inform and inspire, entertain, and engage audiences everywhere.
This is News 88.7.
The romance of war is seductive.
We did exciting things.
But the reality can create pain that lasts forever.
Since that night, we've never been the same, any of us.
Join us for We've Never Been the Same, a war story, from the public radio website transom.org. The story of one night of battle and the decades that followed.
You can hear that Memorial Day at 9 a.m. on News 88.7.
I'm Peter Sagal. The good news for President Trump is that he got a brand new plane. The bad news is that his first trip in it will be to Newark. Join us for the news quiz from NPR.
Saturday and Sunday mornings at 10 o'clock here on News 88.7.
After giving way for a Memorial Day special, Houston Matters returns Tuesday morning at 9 with the latest from the Texas legislature and the director of the Texas Politics Project on whether it could ever become a full-time legislature. Join us.
Aaron Boxerman, a Times correspondent in Jerusalem, on the desperate situation in Gaza and Israel's fears that the world has become an increasingly dangerous place for its people. Aaron, this massive military operation that Netanyahu has basically been threatening, this takeover of Gaza, what would that actually look like?
Well, it's not 100% clear, but when Netanyahu gets up and describes his plans for Gaza to the Israeli public, he talks about full security control of the Gaza Strip after a massive ground maneuver of Israeli forces throughout the enclave. Netanyahu has said that this would be a decisive blow to Hamas and that the Israeli military would seize control of large chunks of the Gaza Strip. They would basically capture them and stay there instead of going in and withdrawing, as they often did during the war. As part of this offensive, at least according to the declared plan, many Palestinian civilians would be displaced to southern Gaza. And at the end of the operation, Netanyahu has promised the public, Israel would effectively have complete security control of the Gaza Strip. But even though the Israeli military has already formally announced the start of the operation, Israeli forces on the ground have not actually moved that much farther.
I mean, that's kind of my question, why they haven't already swept in.
There are still a number of factors that I think are giving them pause. One of them is definitely the hostages. So around 20 of the hostages in Gaza are still believed to be alive. There are the bodies of more than 30 others that are presumed dead. But there's absolutely a fear in Israel that a massive military campaign in Gaza could significantly endanger or kill the remaining hostages that are still alive. Another factor is Netanyahu himself. Throughout the war, he's really refrained from making any big strategic decision about the future of Gaza, about what would be in the enclave in the so-called day after the war ends. This contrasts rather sharply with some of his coalition partners, who are much more committed to permanent Israeli rule in Gaza and to building Jewish settlements in Gaza. And I think a third factor that could be a potential check on Israel launching this massive offensive is the state of the military. Israel's military has been fighting for more than a year and a half nonstop, and the country's own security establishment is anxious about the feasibility of a protracted campaign in the Gaza Strip.
And why are they worried about that?
Israel is already engaged in, really the longest, most intense war of its history in Gaza, far outstripping the Yom Kippur War in 1973 or the Six-Day War in 1967. The war has really taxed Israel's capacities in many ways, and particularly its soldiers. In recent weeks, we've started to see a real shift in Israeli public opinion. If In the early days, right after the Hamas attack on October 7th, the Israeli public was almost totally unified behind the campaign in Gaza. The question is now much more fraught. We've seen opinion polls that show that a majority of Israelis support a deal that would free the hostages in exchange for ending the war. And I think there is also a growing sense among Israelis of, how long can this really last?
Mm-hmm.
Does this war really still have a purpose, or has it lost its way? I interviewed one reservist who, described how he couldn't shake the feeling that Israel was sinking into the sands of Gaza, that it was sort of having its own Vietnam moment, in the sense that the United States continued to fight the war in Vietnam well after many had concluded that the war fundamentally could not be won.
Mm.
At least some people have said that they no longer want to participate in the war because they feel that it no longer serves a purpose, or because they've been worn down by hundreds of days of reserve duty.
One thing I didn't hear you talk about in terms of why Israel might be hesitating, or why Netanyahu might be hesitating, is humanitarian concerns. How much does Israel actually care about those concerns?
So I think Israel does care about these concerns. At the end of the day, Israel is not a superpower. It relies on its allies. It needs, diplomatic backing from the rest of the world. It relies extensively on the United States, its biggest patron. And for all of the bravado and bluster that we hear from Israeli leaders, I think, they do recognize that they have to sometimes make concessions. So, for example, Netanyahu, he said diplomatically, we can't allow things in Gaza to become catastrophic. We can't allow there to be starvation in Gaza. And on one level you have rhetoric, and then on another level there's realpolitik, and there's interests. And Netanyahu had to sort of walk a fine line between these different competing interests, both inside Israel and inside his own coalition, inside his own security establishment, and then also among his allies abroad.
Mm-hmm. Aaron, since we've been talking, the more details have emerged about the shooter. He's been charged with murder, and that he told police that he, quote unquote, did it for Gaza. And it makes me wonder how many people in Israel are looking at the shooting and thinking the world hates us and there could be more of this? Or are people thinking this is exactly how we suspected people felt about us all along, and that's why we need to keep fighting?
So some officials have made exactly the latter argument. And that's what Netanyahu was saying. On Thursday night in Israel, he made a statement where he invoked the horrific shooting before pivoting to how Israel couldn't accept an end to the war before Hamas's total defeat. And on the other hand, you also have some people on the left who look at this incident and they draw a totally different conclusion. From their perspective, it wasn't criticism of the war, which was making the world less safe for Jews and for Israelis. It's just the war, which has had a horrible toll and whose end, as far as all of us can tell, is still nowhere to be seen.
Aaron, thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel.
The Daily is supported by Total Wine & More. This summer season, with so many bottles to choose from, Total Wine & More helps shoppers love what they find. Total Wine & More. Drink responsibly, be 21. Go deeper into the day's most pressing stories with New York Times journalists, trusted sources, and the people affected. The Daily, from the New York Times, distributed by American Public Media.